Okay, so hi everybody. My name is Ann Castiglione. Welcome to the Emotional Support Animals session. This is Zoom Room B for anyone who might have gotten mixed up in the rooms. My name is Ann Castiglione. I'm a volunteer at My Dog Is My Home for the Conference Planning Committee. I'm also currently a University of Wolverhampton PhD student, and I'm really interested in researching the intersection between animal behavior and social justice work. So I'm going to be this session's moderator, and I am pleased to help facilitate the conversation as well. Emotional support animals have become a hot topic in housing over the past few years, and I'm sure many of you will have questions about the information that's being presented today. So if you want to just go ahead and drop those questions in the chat as they come up, we will be having a Q&A sessions for 15 minutes after the speakers are finished. So just go ahead and drop those in the chat as they come up. As defined by the U.S. Housing and Urban Development, an emotional support animal is any animal that provides emotional support alleviating one or more symptoms or effects of a person's disability. Emotional support animals provide companionship, relieve loneliness, and sometimes help with depression, anxiety, and certain phobias, but do not have to have special training in order to perform tasks that assist people with disabilities. This is a direct quote from HUD. Individuals with disabilities may request to keep an assistance animal as a reasonable accommodation to a housing provider's pet restrictions. Housing providers cannot refuse to make a reasonable accommodation in rules, policies, practices, or services when such accommodations may be necessary to afford a person with a disability the equal opportunity to use and enjoy a dwelling. This seems straightforward, but emotional support animals have become quite a contentious topic. It is important for homeless advocates and people who work with this population to understand emotional support animals because often people experiencing homelessness also have disabilities. To help us understand the issues better, we have some great speakers today. Janet HOY-GERLACH from the University of Toledo and DANIELA FOLEY from the University of Toledo and the University of Toledo Humane Society, and Kurt Sass from Community Access. So first up, we're going to have Janet HOY-GERLACH and DANIELA FOLEY. Janet is a social worker, educator, and researcher seeking to improve the well-being of people and human and non-human animals through recognition and support of the human-animal bond and health and mental health care and human services. She is the co-author of Human-Animal Interaction, a social work guide, published by Nassau Press in 2017. Janet served as an expert witness on emotional support animals for the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and recently completed a study detailing the benefits of ESAs that can be accessed for free at the link that has just been dropped in the chat. Joining Janet is DANIELA, a current advanced standing Masters of Social Work student at the University of Toledo. She has always had a love for animals. She found her calling while interning at the Toledo Humane Society and working directly with Hope and Recovery Pets, or the HARP program clients at her current MSW internship placement. After graduation, DANIELA hopes to continue to help companion animals and their people. DANIELA also has a therapy dog named Archie who spends most of his days comforting families and the employees of Hospice of Northwest Ohio. Thank you so much for joining us, DANIELA and Janet. Please begin when you're ready.
Thank you so much, Anne. So we have some slides prepared that my understanding is you're going to be pulling up at your end. Is that correct?
Yes, so we should have, yep, here we go.
Perfect. Okay. Go ahead to the next slide. So I want to start briefly by sharing how it is I came to be here in front of you speaking about emotional support animals. I've always been a quote unquote animal person, animal lover. So I always got it at a personal level in terms of you know, how we can have a deep and profound bond with another species. When I was working as a social worker, a clinical social worker some years back now, I was doing risk assessments with folks who were acutely suicidal. And one thing I always asked was, what has stopped you up until now from acting on your suicidal thoughts, your plan? I can't take credit for that question. That was part of my training, to look for the protective factors, the lifelines, what were helping people to stay alive. And I got the things that I was taught in my education, my training, my supervision. Typical answers like, I can't leave my kids, I wouldn't do that to my family, my friends. It's against my faith, my spiritual beliefs. I also got another answer, which this group is not going to be surprised at, I'm sure. And often enough that it gave me pause. It was people saying, I can't leave my animal. And two things about that struck me. The first was, as a person, that has deep connections with animals myself, I totally got it. The other part of it that struck me was nowhere in my preparation, my training, nowhere, education, had it been brought up that the human-animal bond could literally be a protective factor to the point where it could be helping people to stay alive. And yet, on a regular basis, I was having people tell me just that they were literally still alive because they did not feel that they could leave their companion animal behind. And so when I did some digging and realized very little had been done that recognized that bond, or responded to support it in either social work or human health care, I really started to focus on that. So fast forward to now, next slide. I've been doing a lot of work. One thing that can help advocacy is research and data. Certainly people with lived experience already know a lot of what we're going to talk about in terms of how animals can be incredibly helpful. And certainly animals that we have a bond with, particularly so, but it's not even required. It can be an animal we just met. So just for illustration, these two pictures, one pair just met probably like 30 seconds, literally, before the picture was taken. One pair has been together for 12 years. If you look on the expressions on the human faces, I think we would agree that they are both having benefit from this interaction, but it's not immediately identifiable which is which. And I could ask you for guesses, so maybe think to yourself. And if you were thinking it's the pair on the right that's been together for 12 years when the picture was taken, you're correct. The pair on the left had just met. That's actually a therapy animal that came to visit with somebody else. So what we're talking about is human-animal interaction with an animal maybe you've just met versus the human-animal bond, which is what is shared with an emotional support animal, an animal that lives with somebody. Next slide. So, typo. To help us and give us a language when we're advocating, we're going to share about briefly the overview of the science behind how and why are emotional support animals impactful for people living with health and mental health issues. Next slide. So we can think about how animals are helpful or therapeutic, just very broadly, one of two ways. The first is the natural benefits that they offer through being with us, being present in our lives, interacting with us. This is what research refers to as like the natural benefits. The second is what animals can learn and be taught. When I say animals, I'm using that to refer to non-human animals. And they can be taught all sorts of tasks and complicated activities to help us. So if we look at the pictures, at the top is a woman using a wheelchair. My guess is her cat was not taught to do that. Kitty's just hanging out on the lap because That's probably something they do. The bottom, however, this dog is pressing a button that opens a door, which, you know, could be a significant accessibility assistance for a person using a chair that has mobility issues. So 2 examples. One is just everyday living together benefit. The other is complex training. Next slide, please. This is a video. In the interest of time, I'm not going to show it, but it went viral. And basically the picture says it all. This is just a little girl who was crying and a kitty that came up and nestled against her and put a paw on her face and pressed up. Again, was this cat trained to do this? It certainly did not look that way. It looked like it was just an authentic experience, example of a benefit. Yes, you know, the little girl stopped crying, seemed comforted, but not through training. Next slide. The natural benefits, okay? So the ways that an animal, a companion animal, can help us really fall along the lines of our human functioning. So biological, psychological, and social functioning, all of those intersecting together that affect our health and mental health. Next slide. So if we take the benefits of human-animal interaction that are documented in research, peer-reviewed research, the pictures across the top, you see somebody walking, physical activity, somebody feeding a cat. That might not look like a benefit. However, we know structure, schedules, getting up to care for another being can help us motivate toward our own well-being. Then we see social, somebody's getting greeted when they come in the door. And on the far right, there's some snuggle love happening. And again, none of these are particularly training related. The dog walking, perhaps. My dogs, you know, will walk on a leash. Many dogs walk much more calmly and you know, behavior standard appropriate. But all of these offer benefits that research has borne out. Next slide. So if we look at the first, physical benefits, I think most of us will think dogs and we'll think walking, and that's very accurate. However, there is another body of research that is particularly relevant for emotional support animals, dogs, cats, rabbits. That is what we would call contact-related benefits. And that's hugging, well, the hugging dogs don't necessarily, but like holding, petting, touching. Maybe that's a better word. And that's related to oxytocin, which is a bonding hormone that is released in social mammals, so not just humans, but all sorts of other mammals that bond. It was discovered in breastfeeding studies of humans, and then found that it could be, you know, between adult humans and even across species. And if we're gazing at our dog, our oxytocin can be released, and actually the dogs as well. And it's associated with feel-good sort of emotions as well as a group of physical processes. Next slide. So the oxytocin, this is just a picture of a whole range of ways. Research around this is really picking up steam that support human well-being. Next slide. And this is a statement now almost 10 years old from the American Heart Association, so mainstream medical association, basically indicating, yes, there is a relationship between human heart health and having a companion animal, particularly a dog. They're not saying, hey, go out and get a dog if you don't want, you know, a heart issue, but they're saying this research is decent, it's strong. I mean, this isn't fringe, this is valid. Next slide is a screenshot of a big cohort study, a twin study in Sweden, almost 35,000, because they have a national healthcare system. So they were able to track over time, same kind of findings. Animals in our lives as companions have protective factors toward heart health. Why? We speculate, of course, the activity, but also oxytocin. In addition to the feel good, it slows heart rate, respiration rate, and blood pressure, which is sort of a trifecta of symptoms that are, if they are elevated over time, are associated with cardiac issues. These are also stress response, which is something that is adaptive if we have to run or fight, but if we're dealing with like a financial stress, not as helpful. And the oxytocin that we can have released in us through contact with, or even having our animals with us, helps to mitigate that. Next slide. Another large study, this one also in the United States, basically confirming the 2013 statement. So this isn't really debated. This is generally accepted. Next slide.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and jump in and do a couple slides here. Like I was introduced at the beginning, my name is Daniela Foley. So going over some of those psychological benefits that come along with being a dog, cat, or just any companion animal owner in general. Number one thing is those roles. You can identify as seen in that photo, the cat dad, the cat mom, any of those. You get that new role and a new title. A lot of it comes with the self-efficacy and also comes with a sense of purpose when you own or are a cat mom, cat dad, etc. And you're having a life, an animal relying on you, so you have a sense of purpose outside of your own everyday routine of yourself. And it also creates behavior activation. With that, you're taking care of an animal when that comes with getting up to go on walks, feeding the animal. It gives you a sense of purpose, back to the sense of purpose, and a behavior to get out of bed and create an everyday schedule and routine. And that is beneficial for individuals that have, say, a mental health ailment or anything along those lines. If you can go to the next slide. There's a handful of emotional benefits that come with companion animals. There's the increased feelings of well-being. Companion animals become a source of comfort and affection for their owners. And animals also become a friend, or to a lot of people, a child to the owner. And this decreases that feeling of loneliness or isolation to the owner. If you go on to the next slide. So the social benefits, there are two different versions of those social benefits, the direct and indirect. The direct is just the companionship from the animal to the owner. So it's a source of comfort and affection. Again, as you can see, like that kitty there who's helping that lady do her office work, or the lady who celebrated her 90th birthday at the top with them. So it's a social benefit in that having that friend or child companionship. Indirect, the animal creates opportunities for interaction. So if you're taking out your dog for a walk, someone might be interested in petting your dog and strike up a conversation. Oh, what kind of breed, etc., age. So if they're out for a walk, you're going to have someone that might be interested in having a short conversation with you, all because you simply have a dog with you. We will be discussing later in this our Hope and Recovery Pets program, but a specific story before we get into the nitty-gritty of what that program is we had a client who had a neighbor who would see the cat out sitting in the window, and every single day the woman would see the cat sitting in the window, and eventually this became a conversation starter for one of our clients, or sorry, the neighbor of the client, and the ladies became friends. I believe they still get together every so often to have tea or coffee, but just because they had that cat, it was indirect, creating an interaction opportunity for the individual, our client who had the animal, and that outside neighbor. We can go up to the next slide, please. So a lot of the social benefits also come down to the social determinants of health, which includes the isolation and loneliness, which is a significant risk factor for health, as well as older adults typically report feeling less lonely when they have an animal with them, a companion animal. And then I can go on to the next slide as well.
Oh, thank you for that, Daniela. And we'd be happy to provide sources for any of you. There's a lot of research coming out. So the idea of emotional support animals where they're not trained to do anything, so they're not really of benefit to people. People just want their pets with them, which is a whole other conversation because our companion animals are incredibly beneficial in many ways to health and well-being. However, in particular, an emotional support animal, there's this whole body of research support that we can use to advocate. And of course, we also have, the legal structures through the Fair Housing Act. The stress mediation effect is basically the idea that these work together. Just like all of our, biological, psychological, social, emotional, we're kind of like a big, bowl of soup of all those things. The same way it's the way that animals can affect our lives, really it's more integrated. So the idea, for a person with severe anxiety, having that animal can provide emotional comfort. The touch can release oxytocin that slows the heart rate, the respiration rate, the blood pressure. The animal may also, just by presence, sometimes, company can help us to self-regulate if it's, somebody that we have a positive bond with, that is. So it's sort of the integration of those things that is thought to mediate a lot of the stress reactions that we are hardwired to have as humans. And then when we have clients with severe stress, like not having a safe, or permanent place to live, for example, and other kinds of health or mental health issues that can be worsened by stress, it's that much more important that they have access to their animal companions to get these protective factors. Next slide. Just a point in case that the animals are often, if they're brought to hospitals to visit in like a therapy animal role or a school, a lot of times the focus is on patients, students, but the staff, which I'm sure many of us could speak to, also benefit from interactions with animals. Next slide. Just a word about therapeutic. Next slide. I put in definitions right out of Merriam, but basically the idea is that the animal has a benefit and has a positive effect on a person. And again, for any of us, quote unquote, the general population, whoever that is, our animals can benefit us. For people with particular health or mental health challenges, it can be very impactful. Next slide. So again, how therapeutic? I'm often asked that, and I go back to, we have the biopsychosocial benefits. That's the natural kinds of benefits. And then of course we have the task training. I would not, close my eyes and follow one of my dogs across the street. We are very closely bonded, but they're not taught to do that. Conversely, the picture at the top of the screen here, my guess is oxytocin is going through both of them and all those good things that happen as well. Next slide. Daniela, did you want to, is this you? I think you're muted.
Oops. Yes, I will jump in. So when it comes to the therapeutic roles of animals, there are like the 3 different levels for the most part when it comes to animals involved with humans. The emotional and personal pets are definitely the least amount of training. Those, you're not going to, for the most part, train a dog. You're probably going to train basic obedience to be able to live in your house, make sure it goes to the bathroom outside, things like that. The next level, higher level of training comes to therapy animals. Therapy animals are required to go through a little bit more training, but still they're not going to be able to do a lot of those tasks that, say, a service animal will be able to do for you, such as, seeing eye dogs, PTSD service dogs, any sort of dog that does those specific things for people to lessen their disability or help with their disability. If you want to go on to the next slide. So service animals or assistance animals are trained animals to do specific tasks in order to reduce or compensate for disability-related impairments. These are most commonly, the hearing, mobility, vision, psychiatric, seizure, sleep apnea, psychiatric, things like that. When it comes to these animals, they are the only animal who has public access through the ADA without other stipulations, which we'll get into on the next slide, actually. Oh, sorry, psychiatrics. I think in no, if you can want to stay back on this slide just for a second. The next slide itself does have a video, but in the context of time, I can explain it to you real quick. It is based in Britain. It shows, it's a little graphic, but it's nothing crazy. It definitely shows the benefit of an individual having that service and assistance dog because of the man's PTSD. It starts off with a scene of him having a very graphic war flashback, has someone come up and start to wake him up, and then actually it shows the man licking the other man's face, and then he wakes up from his dream, and it's his service dog who has woken him up from this dream because his dog is trained to understand that he is having a bad dream or like a war flashback, and he can wake him up to get him out of that, as well as turn on lights and do kind of like deep pressure therapy and lean against him, all kinds of like grounding things. So if you want to go to 2 slides over.
And I just want to interject. A lot of times people will ask me, what's the difference between a psychiatric service animal and an emotional support animal? They both benefit people. That is not the difference. Mm-hmm. The difference is the psychiatric service animal is trained to do things, as Daniela just described. The ESA helps through the ways we've been talking about, the biopsychosocial benefits.
Right, exactly. So the next one is that middle level, is that registered therapy animals. They provide the natural untrained human animal bond benefits in many settings, oftentimes hospitals, hospice, even schools. So these animals, typically dogs, must pass a basic obedience class, as well as things like Canine Good Citizen and various other classes, just to get them very attuned to their handler. So after that, they are evaluated and become a registered therapy dog through a handful of programs called Therapy Dogs International, Pet Partners. I added Alliance of Therapy Dogs. That's my therapy dog, is through that. Mm-hmm. Archie. I think that's why Janet always puts me on this slide, because she wants me to talk about Archie. He spends a lot of time at hospice. Honestly, he's good for the people that are in hospice, their families, but he's definitely there for a stress reliever when it comes to the staff. Mm-hmm. So I think that we are all set on those slides. If you want to slide to the next one as well.
So what is an ESA? An ESA, I've had people suggest, well, if we're going to write a letter for an ESA, we should have the person pass a pet partners test. Nope, not necessary. An ESA is functionally no different than a companion animal or a pet. The difference is that they are documented. We call it a verification letter by a knowledgeable person, typically a healthcare, mental health care professional or staff, somebody who knows the person, knows their needs, provides help, therapeutic support through the natural benefits, biopsychosocial, those slides we looked at, that help reduce distress or impairment related to that person's health or mental health condition. Next slide. We'll keep going. So ESA comes from federal law, the Fair Housing Act. This is anti-discrimination law. So it is not the Social Security, level of disability. It's not workers' comp. I've had people say, well, I don't know how to do a disability evaluation. I can't write a letter for my clients or this person. That's a whole other level of disability. Many people with disabilities work to get Social Security, to get workers' comp. Typically, you have to have impairment from your disability to where you're not able to work. And certainly that would qualify you for an ESA as well, but the threshold is completely different. Air Carrier Access Act, unfortunately, that's rolled back, so ESAs are no longer recognized. So it is fair housing law. Next slide. Again, to protect against discrimination, including against discrimination for people with disabilities who may need their animals as an accommodation. Next slide. So this is the actual definition. I won't read it to you, but an ESA, once the letter is written stating that the person needs the animal due to, you know, a health or mental health condition that impairs one or more areas of daily functioning, that is no longer considered a pet. The animal is considered an accommodation for the person's health or mental health. Next slide. So if we look at, keep going, companion animal, therapeutic benefit. Next slide. I'm sorry, next, yeah, must meet the definition of disability under Fair Housing Act. It's fairly straightforward, and the animal's presence or benefits need to help alleviate aspects of the person's condition. Again, pretty straightforward. Next slide. So how to determine if somebody qualifies? Basically, you need to check off those 3 points. Next slide. Examples where a person would not be somebody that would benefit from an ESA, and probably that we wouldn't want, you know, the animal with them. They don't want the animal. They have fear. They're violent toward animals. If they have an active substance use disorder, that it's impairing their ability to care for the animal. Cultural issues with species of animals, anything like that, you know, the person has to have the regard for the animal. Next slide. I believe I sent the link to Anna and Christine. This is a memo that came out in 2020. That's a wonderful go-to. It came out from HUD, really to help debunk literature that was coming out saying that you have to have a disability evaluation from an expert evaluator to have an ESA. Clinicians and practitioners shouldn't write the letters. It's a conflict of interest, so on and so forth. This memo debunks all of that. It basically explains that letters should be written based on our knowledge that we have of a person through service provision and interaction. And they use more medical model language, you know, diagnosis, treatment, et cetera. But, you know, this is the knowledge that we should be using, not like a whole, you know, we took a 5-hour workshop on how to do a disability evaluation for Social Security, and now we're going to use that for the 2 different apples and oranges. Next slide. Basically, you need a yes answer to both of these questions. Does your person have the health or mental health condition? Will having the animal help reduce distress or impairment related to that condition? If yes to both, then you have a person who would qualify for ESA as an accommodation under fair housing. Next slide. There are additional parameters that states may put around it, but the federal law is basically a kind of a floor. Like, the states can be more expansive, but they can't take away any of the federal protections. If they are, then that's a Department of Justice issue. Like, this is the minimal kind of accommodation. And again, that HUD memo from 2020, I go to all the time. I send to people. It lays it out very nicely. Next slide. Some mental health diagnoses, this is from the HUD memo, links right there, essentially have been determined to automatically qualify under the Fair Housing Act as a disability. You can see major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, PTSD, traumatic brain injuries. It doesn't exclude anything else. It just means if your person already has been diagnosed with this, then you've already checked the first thing. We don't even need, you know, the idea that they need a whole, like, you know, 3-hour disability evaluation is a bunch of hooey. It's not accurate. Next slide. More on disability. I'll let you look at the memo for that. Next slide. Major life activities, the things that we need to do to get through our days. You know, lots of things. Anything from like reading, concentrating, to like walking and, you know, moving and executive functioning, like self-care kinds of things. Next slide. We need to have an understanding of how the animals are therapeutic. We don't need to put that in the letter, but if somebody challenges you and you end up in like a legal, like being questioned capacity, which I have, you basically just need to think about like, what are those biopsychosocial benefits that animals provide? Where are the areas my person struggles? How do those benefits help offset the struggles? Put that in a progress note, and you should be pretty clear on how the animal is therapeutic and how the animal is helping. So that is more, you know, I think a lot of us have this in our heads, but making it explicit helps us if this is challenged, which unfortunately it can be. Next slide. So yeah, this just reiterates, think about your persons. Like one person with depression may have symptoms, but they express themselves in a person's life differently. One person may have trouble getting out of bed. Another person may be tearful, and you know, being alone is difficult. So both of those, I can, you know, think of ways an animal could help offset that. Companionship and that activation and motivation Daniela was talking about. In our HARP program, you know, we had people talk about, like, I wasn't getting out of bed before I had my animal. I would just stay in bed all day, but now I can't do that. I mean, I won't do that. I won't do that. Like, the animal needs me. So I step up, not for me, but for them. Next slide. And this, more examples that we can get you the slides. So it's basically symptoms and then the benefits from human-animal interaction research, just connecting the dots. Next slide. This is a great article. This is a person who wrote basically about her cat and how the cat supported her with trauma symptoms. Next slide. And again, I won't read it to you, but her cat is Ernest Hemingway. He lays on her, he helps ground her, the warmth, the purring vibration. Again, none of this trained. So the idea that the animals have to be trained to be therapeutic, no. It's a different kind of help. The training can be invaluable, absolutely necessary, but that doesn't negate how the natural benefits can also help people. And that's the piece that, you know, as advocates, we educate ourselves and then we can take that forward because the legal framework is already there. It's just, there's a lot of skepticism and misinformation. Next slide. The question, would Ernest qualify as an ESA? Yes, absolutely, no question. She literally says she was unable to get up after he laid on her and purred for a bit. She then was able to get up and go forward. Next slide. The last part really hits the elements of, I love that picture, of an ESA letter. I know we're short on time, so let's click forward to the actual letter. Keep going. Okay, this is just a stock example, but the key parts, the letterhead. So if you have an agency, your letterhead, I like to say to whom it may concern and give it to the person. And then I don't have to deal with a release. They can show it. It's their information. I know some places, some agencies are going to have rules for their staff. But in terms, you know, so that's agency level policy. But in terms of what, you know, people have a right to their information. So the name of the person, that you know their mental health condition, appropriate gender pronoun, that they meet the definition of disability under fair housing. You don't have to put the disability. If they want you to, fine, but they don't have to. That they need the animal. I would not specify an animal. You can if the person requests and it's, you know, apparent that it's this, you know, brown dog, but you don't have to. And that the animal alleviates the the impairment or the difficulty related to their condition, sign it, date it, license. A lot of people put license number if they have it. But basically whatever your credentials are, and the animal can now be recognized as an ESA. Places may have forms that they say that the person has to fill out. That's not a Fair Housing Act requirement. That's an agency requirement that actually is not, I don't want to say it's illegal, but that's my understanding from the attorneys I talk. I mean, that they can't put extra requirements on accommodations. Unfortunately, it takes energy and effort to push back. If you're already stressed and not feeling good, it might be easier to just be like, here, Janet, please do the form. I don't want to talk to the Fair Housing Center and have a, 3-week battle about this form. Please just, can you do it for me? Okay. I want to fight back, but that's the person's choice. They get to decide that. So, but these are the basic elements. And again, that memo will lay it out as well.
Janet, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're at time, but thank you so much for sharing this wonderful talk. Both you and Daniela were wonderful. I'm sure a lot of people are going to have any questions. Anyone with questions, please just go ahead and drop those questions in the chat, and we will be doing a 15-minute Q&A after our next speaker is over. So I will go ahead and start the introduction for Kurt. So yes, next up we have Kurt Sass. Kurt is a lifelong New Yorker. Born in Brooklyn in 1957, he subsequently moved to Queens and now resides in the Bronx. He worked in the banking and mortgage industry for almost 20 years until suffering a 2-year-long psychiatric episode. After recovery, he decided to help other mental health consumers and has been doing so for Community Access Incorporated for over 20 years. Community Access is a pioneer of supporting housing and social services in New York City and leading advocate in human rights, social justice, and economic opportunities for people with mental health concerns. Kurt's cat, Pookie, is the psychologist and his physical therapist. Welcome, Kurt. Please begin whenever you're ready.
I just unmuted myself. Hello, everybody. First of all, thank you both, Janet and Daniela. That was a wonderful presentation. Beautiful. First thing I want to say is I'm going to try to keep it a little brief because I saw so many fantastic questions. I'm going to try to make it so there's a little more than 15 minutes for the questions because I saw so many wonderful ESA questions especially. So, but I want to tell you a little bit about our program, Pet Access and Community Access. So the program is, first of all, the slide. The woman on the right, her name is Michelle. The reason I want to tell you a little about Michelle is, for the first couple of years of Pet Access, we spoke to everyone, we said, as pet owners. So Michelle came to me one day and said, we're not pet owners, we're pet parents. So now she opened our eyes and now everyone's a pet parent. The only thing is with Community Access and the Pet Access program is we're self-funded, so it's only for community access. We're one of the few agencies in the country, supported housing agencies, that allow pets in supported housing. Most don't. So next slide, please. Okay, Community Access was founded in 1974. We are one of the oldest and largest housing organizations for people with mental illness, homelessness, and a lot of different variables. We operate 1,600 housing units in 20 sites. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, even though we opened in 1974, we didn't allow pets until 2002. Somebody had a crazy idea in 2002 that pets might actually have a positive impact on people that are going through a psychiatric disorder. So Pet Access was born in 2002 with the idea that pets could be therapeutic and help people in their recovery process. Now, as I said before, anyone in Community Access can get a pet on their own. We do have, in addition to that, we have the Pet Access Program. Now, the Pet Access Program, what we provide to people, there is a process in Pet Access, but what we provide is we'll pay for the adoption, startup supplies. For example, if it's a cat, we'll pay for 2 months of food, 2 months of litter box, the carrier, and items such as a brush, toy, and bowls, and vet care up to $700. And the other thing is, Pet Access, our slogan is 50% tenant, 50% pet. The pet has to come from a shelter. So that's very, very important. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, as I said before, unfortunately, it's only open to community access tenants and program participants. Now, the difference, as I said, although anyone can get a pet that lives in community access housing, in order to get a pet through Pet Access, where we will actually finance a lot of things, first of all, there's an application program that has to be filled out. If the person has a roommate, we need their written approval. The next thing is very important. They must have 2 secondary caretakers. This is vital to anyone who's thinking of having pets in their program. This is so many times this has happened where someone has been hospitalized, or God forbid they pass away, or number of situations where the secondary caretaker has come through and taken care of the pet. We also have the pet trainer visit for an orientation session. We actually have this vetting process, and we never turn anyone down. We always will revisit an application. For example, we had a person who had a studio apartment and was a smoker, and we knew that wasn't safe for a pet. And this person wanted their pet so much that she had made a promise that she would stop smoking. So with the help of their service coordinator, she actually went through, she got the patch, and after she stopped smoking for 6 months, we revisited the application. She got a pet, and this pet actually helped her before she got the pet. She quit smoking and then got her pet. So another thing we'll do, sometimes someone will want a pet that's not really the best for them. Say someone will apply for a pet, and they don't really understand that taking a dog out 3 times a day, we realize that they're not going to do that. So they'll apply for a dog and they'll end up getting a cat. Next slide, please. Okay. So if the person is approved, the service coordinator and the applicant will go to the pet shelter together. Now, the applicant will pick out the pet that they want. It is their choice. We believe in consumer choice. Now, the service coordinator will advise them. We do have cases, for example, where the tenant will fall in love with a pet that has many, many health concerns. And although it is their choice at the end, the service coordinator will point out, well, there's many health concerns, and it could be very expensive, and you're on a limited income, that sort of thing. But it is the applicant's choice. The only 2 caveats we have is, and we've changed over the years, no dogs over 40 pounds, which is true in many apartment buildings. And we've learned no kittens and no puppies, because we've learned that many of our applicants, they want the cute kitten, they want the cute puppy, but then they realize how much work is really involved taking care of the cute kitten and the cute puppy. So after the adoption, the applicant and the service coordinator pick up the supplies. And also, as I mentioned before, we cover vet care up to $700. Fortunately, nothing is required at the beginning as far as vet care, because since the pet is adopted from a shelter, the complete checkup and neutering, the pet is spayed or neutered, and all the vet fees are paid for up front. Pet has a complete checkup. Next slide, please. Okay, They also received, Pet Access came up with a 23-page pet resource guide covering anything from food pantries, volunteer opportunities, grooming, training tips. And we even have like, we were able to locate like support groups to deal with pets' death and other things like pet cemeteries and things like that. And one of the most important things is that every year we send out a pet survey, a pet parent survey to all our pet parents. And I'm going to give you some wonderful, touching examples later of what our pet parents reveal to us every year. Next slide, please. We just reached our 130th adoption. The reason we don't have more is that we actually, as I said before, Pet Access is 50% pet, 50% pet owner. When I first started, Pet Access started in 2002, and I started facilitating in 2008. Back then, we would put up when I started, we were putting up flyers in the building, and a lot of our tenants thought of it as, oh, this is a way of getting a free pet. And we had a lot of negative outcomes where we had to find other pet owners. The adoptions didn't work out. So now what we do is we leave it to our service coordinators, who actually were fortunate. All our service coordinators work in the same building as our tenants. So they see the tenants every day. So they're able to notice who, number one, they feel would benefit from having a pet in their lives. And number two, who they feel would be a responsible pet caretaker. So we've had almost, I would say, 95% positive outcomes with our adoptions. Plus, if it isn't a positive adoption, we've instituted the secondary caretakers. So we have two safety nets in case an adoption doesn't work out. Also, some of our sites, we have about 4 or 5 sites that have temporary housing. Most of our sites are permanent housing, but we have 4 or 5 sites that are temporary housing where people, because of the funding, they're funded by OMH, Office of Mental Health, where they're supposed to live there only for like 2 years and then move on to other housing. The problem with having pets in temporary housing is that when they try to move, if you have a pet in temporary housing and try to move on to supportive housing outside community access, as I mentioned before, almost every other supportive housing agency will not allow pets. So we can't allow our temporary housing tenants to have pets because they would have almost an impossible time finding housing outside community access. So they have house pets, and it works out great. It forms such a great sense of community. The tenants get together, they take turns taking care of the pets. It works out really good. Okay. Now, the types of pets that we sponsor cats, dogs, fish. I got a wonderful story about fish, which opened my eyes, turtles, guinea pigs, birds, rabbits even. We learned an important lesson about rabbits just before my time, that if you get more than one rabbit, make sure it's the same sex. Very important. Learn that lesson before my time, fortunately. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is really important. I should have brought like a fancy graph, but I didn't have one. We've done 4 surveys over a 13-year period of our supported housing tenants. From 2008 to 2020, each one over a 3 or 4 year period. We compared people in our pet access before they had a pet and while they had a pet, and the numbers came out exactly the same in all 4 surveys over the 12-year period. And the number of days in the psychiatric hospital before they had the pet was 3 times as much as when they did have a pet. And it came out almost exactly the same all 4 times. It was just amazing. And as I said, I wish I had a fancy graph, but 3 times is that I can resonate with that. So 3 times as much. Next slide, please. Okay, okay. Now, so I'm almost done, but I have the best part here. While you're looking at these great pictures, the one on the upper left is our pet therapy cat. That goes around to some of our houses. That's our pet therapy cat. So, but I'm going to tell you just 5 little stories about how Pet Access has helped people. Okay, number 1, and most of these came from our pet parent surveys. We have one tenant who has a pet, she's a pet parent to a cat in Pet Access. We've received her pet parent survey, and in her pet parent survey, she said that she used to self-abuse. She used to have a problem with self-abusing for many years, but once she became a pet parent, she actually stopped self-abusing because she couldn't go back to self-abusing and going to the hospital and leave her cat because she just couldn't do that anymore. And she hasn't self-abused in the 6-7 years since she got her cat. It was so touching to me, so amazing. So another one, let's see. Oh, there's another gentleman. He has a dual diagnosis of substance abuse and mental illness. He had been in rehab 8 times, and once he adopted his dog, and this was before my time even, he adopted the dog in 2004. He has not been in rehab since, and for the same reason. He told me he just couldn't go back in rehab, couldn't go back to drugs, because this word is used so often, responsibility. So many people, when I get back the pet parent surveys every year, the word responsibility is used so often. It's such a feeling of responsibility. People have said, I can't leave him, I can't leave her. Responsibility. It's just so amazing. So he has not, since 2004, he hasn't abused drugs after being in 8 rehabs. The next story, there's a woman who adopted a cat, 2012. She was not taking any of her psychiatric medication. She wasn't taking any of her, for any medication for her medical issues. Her cat developed diabetes. Faith is her name, the cat, Faith. I'm allowed, HIPAA allows me, I checked this out even, HIPAA allows me to use the pet's names. So I'm allowed to do that. So Faith developed diabetes. Ever since then, when she had to, we went through the class and learned how to give Faith her insulin every day. Ever since then, the pet parent's been taking her own medication since then, since she started giving Faith her diabetes medicine. So she's taking her own medication now for 9 years. 3 more stories. These are not non-cat dog stories. I just today, in fact, I got a pet parent survey just 2 hours ago from a woman that has birds. This beautiful, touching story about the bird she got from Pet Access reminds her of when she's woman's in her 40s now. I don't know her age. I didn't ask. I believe she's in her late 40s, early 50s. Whenever she looks at her birds, it reminds her of growing up with her mother, who's now deceased, and it just makes her feel so wonderful. And another story, this I have to claim my naivete on this. When I first started Pet Access, that when they told me fish were involved, I didn't get it. I didn't get fish. Fish, how are they going to help people? Spoke to this gentleman. He told me he couldn't get out of bed in the morning, and he was getting some more fish. Some of his fish had died, and I was speaking to him. I said, "That's wonderful, Mr. B." He told me he couldn't get out of bed in the morning, but just by watching his fish line up, they would line up in a school of fish would line up. That would calm him down so much. That was the only way he could get up in the morning. It was so touching. I couldn't believe it just floored me that I didn't get it until he told me how fish could work. Now we have fish all over the place. We have buildings that have fish. People come down to the community room and see their service coordinators because they come down to see the fish, and the service coordinators wait for them in the community room, and that's how they engage with them. It's really wonderful. And the last story I want to tell is my own personal story. Have has said in the introduction, I've had my first psychotic break was in 1979. We had in 2003, my wife's mother passed away suddenly. She was in her 80s, but she passed away suddenly. About a month or so later, we got a cat named Pookie, and it was wonderful for my wife. It really helped her deal with the grief of her mother passing. So, but what I didn't even realize was that I suffer from depression every morning. It takes me a half hour to get out of bed. Ever since we got Pookie, I just look at her and it takes my mind. It doesn't make the depression go away, but she takes my mind off of it. I just concentrate on her, just her sleeping, and it totally takes my mind off of it. And I get to feel what all these pet parents feel, the wonder of a pet. Just, she takes everything away. So I get to feel the beauty of what a pet can do in somebody's life. So, and that's it. I told you I keep it short, but if you want to show the last slide, some more pets, and that's it. Yeah, I
Thank you.
think there's one more slide after that.
Oh,
Yeah.
that is beautiful.
Yeah.
Wow. So cute, kittens.
Yeah. That's
Oh my
a pet
God.
therapy cat. Yeah.
So adorable. Well, thank you so much, Kurt. What a wonderful talk, an incredible story. You're doing amazing work through Pet Access, and I think it's truly unique that a housing provider would so readily recognize and embrace the value of emotional support animals in housing. So I think people probably have a lot of questions for you as well. Anyone that has a question for Kurt, please go ahead and drop that in the chat. And we are now going to go ahead and move into our Q&A portion. So anyone, like I said, please drop your questions in the chat. I will pull them and I will ask them to our speakers. If I could just ask our speakers to keep their microphones off and their videos on as well, so that we can be spotlit. Whoever's talking can be spotlit when I ask a question. So I am going to go ahead and start with some questions for Janet and Daniela. And we have a question here. I am a licensed psychologist. Can you speak to the liability issues that could arise from doing ESA assessments and writing a letter for a person who has an ESA? My malpractice insurance company assures me I am covered. What is your experience on this topic?
So I guess the first thing is that, you know, people can certainly sue us for any reason, whether or not it's legitimate. However, if we stay within our scope of practice, you know, we're generally in good shape, which is why I strongly encourage, unless you also are duly credentialed as, let's say, like a dog trainer or veterinarian, something like that, that we stick at the human side of verification. You know, there are folks that have put out guidelines that indicate we should assess the animals and make statements about the animals and the suitability of that. That's really out of our lane. But, you know, speaking to somebody's depression, anxiety, you know, trauma symptoms, and how benefits of human animal interaction are expected to alleviate that. You know, we are credentialed to do diagnostic assessment. You know, certainly as a psychologist, you've got all of that. So the other piece would just be familiarizing yourself with the basics of human animal bond benefits. But we really want to stay away from, well, I assessed this cat or this dog, or they're suitable, or I think they need to have canine good citizen, and then they'd be okay. We refer, like we, you know, connect with the veterinarian and document, or, you know, animal shelters have trainers or behaviorists or rescue groups that we can help link people with. But that has been the biggest concern that I've seen, is people kind of stepping out of their scope of professional practice and jumping into the animal lane when they're not animal professionals. And again, certainly you may get pushback, but, you know, you'll be solid if you know you're doing what you're trained to do.
Thank you so much for that, Janet.
Great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. We have another question for you or Daniela. For shelter providers, should shelter providers be asking for documentation of ESAs or just taking their people's word for it? We are seeing a huge amount of people that won't separate from their pets who need shelter because they are stating the animals are ESAs. While we offer boarding at no cost to the individual, rarely do people agree to separate. Shelters are not on board with taking any and all animals for many reasons.
I'd be willing to speak to that. I mean, if we look at the Fair Housing Act, the HUD memo I mentioned, let me see if I can find that. Actually, I'm going to drop this in the chat too, just so people have easy access to it. But it starts out, I believe, like the first paragraph, it lays out animals as an accommodation for housing, and it has a footnote, and then it lists all the definitions of housing. And it absolutely, I'm just gonna, says for the purposes of this guidance, again, it's a HUD memo, the term housing refers to all housing covered by the Fair Housing Act, including apartments, condominiums, cooperatives, single-family homes, nursing homes, assisted living facilities, group homes, domestic violence shelters, emergency shelters, homeless shelters, dormitories, and other types of housing covered by the FHA. So technically, turning away a person with an ESA is not legal. Now, if they don't have the documentation to support the ESA claim, then it really becomes a policy decision in terms of, do you want to approach it, kind of from like a low barrier philosophy where, you work with the person and the animal and help them, perhaps to secure the documentation, or, help the person make alternative, accommodations, that kind of thing. I know the National Alliance to End Homelessness has a general policy that can be adapted. That's more like low barrier for pets and animals. And certainly a lot of shelters I know do turn people with ESAs away. I mean, I've had, countless folks describe that to me, but according to the FHA, that actually is not legal. It's also not an anything goes if the animal is disruptive, if it requires a fundamental alteration of operations or the facility. So like, let's say it's a draft horse, a Clydesdale, or the person would require staff to feed and care for the animal. Those are more fundamental changes where the animal is aggressive, disruptive, those kinds of things. All of those, are grounds to request that the person, remove the animal and make alternative arrangements. Certainly things like vaccinations, fleas, that's where partnerships can be really helpful. Humane societies, or, there's a whole national movement of what's being called human animal support services and shelters, accessible veterinary care that I'm sure many of you know much more about than I do, likely. But, those are folks that could help with dealing with those sort of zoonotic, where we don't want people to get ringworm or fleas or, things that the animal might not yet have had treatment for. But generally, legally, the Fair Housing Act does cover the, emergency shelters. So, but with documentation is required for ESAs. So if the person doesn't have that, then it's really a judgment call. And how your shelter wants to work with the person around that.
Thank you so much for that, Janet.
Sure.
We have one more question for you here. I am a housing advocate and work with many individuals who have been chronically unhoused and who are pet owners. If they have not been connected to a health profession and or have a documented disability, how can I go about supporting them getting housed? I don't want to quote unquote fudge the system, but their companions are their world, and surely they would stay outdoors than surrender their animal. So
understanding the question is, how to support the person in getting housing if they're wanting housing, but not at the cost of relinquishing their animal? Is that basically the question? And they're not connected with services?
Yes, I think the question is phrased in that this is an individual who may or may not actually have documentation of a disability.
Right.
And so they're not willing to give up their animal, but they do need housing. So how could this person support that person without, fudging the system as they.
This is, I think, one of the great ironies and failures of how this all is structured, because folks who arguably maybe have sort of the most vulnerabilities around their health or mental health conditions, and arguably again, but may need that support of the animal the most, come up against barriers like this. They don't have linkage to a formal healthcare provider, so they can't as easily request the verification letter. In that instance, so if we look back to the HUD memo for guidance, and then for example, I'm a social worker, so I also look to my professional practice, ethics and guidelines. So of course we're not gonna do anything fraudulent. However, the Fair Housing Act policy really requires that the person verifying a need for accommodation is a reliable source. And reliable, basically means that they have, knowledge, that the data they have is consistent, that points to the person having the disability, the health or mental health issues, and that the animal helps to alleviate them. The housing provider could, certainly ask for a licensed health or mental health care provider, and that's where it gets gray. That would be indicative of, an ongoing consent to treatment kind of relationship. But I've been asked, okay, so I do outreach to people, and I know this person has been hospitalized and they're unhoused, and they have a lot of need, and clearly they have conditions that would meet the FHA criteria, and their animal helps them function. Can I write a letter? And my answer to that would be yes. According to FHA, you've got to be clear in what you're writing, that you're knowledgeable of the person's needs, that they have a condition, that the condition would meet the FHA. You want to be clear, that you're not writing that you're treating them, that you've diagnosed them. You don't want to misrepresent anything, but you can write what you know and provide that to the person. And technically that would fall under the scope of FHA, a reliable verifier. They even note peer support, providers or people in those sort of roles, formal, informal. And there's an attorney, her name is Abby, Volin. She does animal accommodation and disability rights work. She's out of DC. I take a lot of my questions to her. And again, she speaks more to the legal end rather than, scope of practice. And as a health or mental health care provider, we really have to look at both the law and our sort of practice constraints in whatever profession we're in. However, if we stick with what is, truthful, honest, because certainly we may have, reliable knowledge that a person has, had long-term health or mental health care issues, and that clearly, the animal is a stabilizing factor for them. And that would meet the criteria of the FHA. And that kind of goes back to my original comment of it. It's just sort of one of the great, again, the people that probably are most vulnerable and most in need of that protection to access housing. For some reason, it's not structured to meet that. And that is a problem. Another great question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janet. So Kurt, we have a question here for you. The Pet Access Program is fascinating and such a wonderful example of how embracing animals in housing can be a win-win for everyone. Do you have any advice for other housing providers that may want to implement a similar program to yours?
Yes, I have a few bits of advice. The first one is not to be afraid, not to be afraid. The second one, which is very important, is to the rider to the lease. We have a rider to our lease, which everyone has to sign. And the most important thing, I think, is a secondary caretaker. We have 2 secondary caretakers, and I can't tell you how many times that has come in so useful, having 2 secondary caretakers. Very, very important, very important. So many situations where it hasn't worked out, and then some people have stepped up, and also the follow up, like at least every year to get updated information. That was the one, I hate to use the word mistake, but that was the one learning situation where we didn't follow up, and then we tried to contact people, and we had to really play detective, because it's such a stressful situation, as many of us know, when a tenant passes away, and there's so many things you have so much you're doing, and just the other tenants too. You're so concerned about them, and then you add on finding a home for the pet too. So to have that one less major concern and one less stressful situation for the staff and everybody. So that's really the main thing, and it's really not anything. There's a great fear of having pets in the building, but we really have not had many situations. But another thing is, which I love about Pet Access, is we have all these vetting things in place. So I love about Pet Access, as opposed to just having people bring in pets, is that at least someone that goes through Pet Access, there's someone that the pet trainer has visited the apartment, and we know that. Another thing we do, I didn't mention before, is we get their permission to check their rent, and even if they're on PA, even if someone's on PA, we have permission to check that they're doing their due diligence to make sure that they're visiting the PA office, or whatever it is these days, virtually or whatever, that they're doing their due diligence to make sure that the PA is being followed up on and everything like that. So.
Well,
Thank you so much, Kurt. I just have to say what you're doing is amazing. Thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for sharing your story and the other stories. It's really been inspiring. Thank you.
I have to say, I was amazed at how many positive, beautiful outcomes we've had. We've had to tinker with it a lot, but it's really, I think after about 18 years, we're getting it right.
Thank you so much, Kurt, and to all our other speakers as well, Janet and Daniela. This is going to conclude our question and answer section. Thank you for everyone for joining the emotional support animals session here, and I hope everyone learned something new, and I definitely did, and I'm just blown away by what everyone is doing out there. And yes, thank you for all your wonderful questions as well. So right now we're going to have a 15-minute break. And then we will be right back in the main room. So thank you so much for everyone, for our speakers, and for everyone who attended. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the conference.
Thank you, Anne. Do they have access to the slides that I did? Because I see in the comments folks asking for like a sample letter, and I have the template in the slides. If that's something that
yes, they don't have access to these slides, but I can talk to Christine about that. We might be able to drop that in the chat in the main room, since this room would be closing in a few minutes. And yeah, so we should be able to get that out there, but we just don't have that to drop in the chat here. So, but the HUD memo that you mentioned is in the chat, as well as some other links to your research and some of the other things you mentioned. So
perfect. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.